Welcome to lesson 7, and we're going to talk about a couple of things today, and hope you had a good break and week off and all that. And I know so we have 2 homework assignments coming up, so hopefully we've been working on those because they're both due this coming Monday. And it's really important like to get those done and not to be late because it'll kind of pick up starting next week, because then you'll have your individual assignments and you'll want time to work on your own projects. So I'm going to try to dive in because I know last week was a little rushed and didn't really get into Xcode. I mean, just briefly, and hopefully that's enough to kind of get started with your homework, but I understand also if you haven't finished it and you're waiting. And so hopefully, I really hope that this assignment, this lecture will help make the homework assignment easier, and any remaining questions sort of bring some clarification there. All right, so let's get to it. So Xcode, that's the development environment. You should already be kind of familiar if you've started the homework. So just to help maybe clarify things in case they haven't already been so, I'm going to just look at the basics. So the first thing to note is we look at the whole window, just to get an idea of the interface and what we have going on. So on the left-hand side, you see navigation area, and this is where your files and folders go. Across the top, you'll see there's like a play button, a stop button, and then it might have the name of your project and all that, and this is called the toolbar. And then the main area, the editor area, in this case, we're actually looking at the target, this sort of settings file, and you can see it says display name and bundle identifier, and we'll look at that later, but this area, the editor area, is where all the code goes. Below that, you have the debug area. This is where if you do a print statement, right, and then you run the project. So down below that in the debug area is where print statements will show up when the project is running. And on the right, something called the utility area, and it has a bunch of contextual windows. So what maybe is the most important thing to note is the thing on the right changes depending on the file that you're looking at. And we'll take a look at this in an interactive way in just a sec. Now, when we're looking at Swift UI, you may see things like this. And again, the homework would have already kind of gone through this, but you can see that the canvas on the right-hand side will show you a preview. And what's kind of neat is it is directly linked so that when you highlight Hello World, you can see it as actions like embed in HStack, embed in VStack, these kinds of things. And so by clicking this GUI on the right, the canvas, it will actually change the code, right? And it will alter the code on the left. And again, the homework goes through this in a nice interactive way, kind of showing you the interoperability of it. You can also see the utility panel on the right has changed to be contextual, and you can see there are things like padding, font, all these modifiers. And again, if you change those in this GUI interface on the right-hand side, it will actually add and change the code. So for example, you see it says font, it says large title, and also on the left-hand side, you see it says dot font, parentheses dot large title. So today we're going to cover a couple of things. First is Intro to Xcode, so what we just talked about, but we're going to look at it a little more in depth and interactively. And then you've already been using views, and it's good to use them, and sometimes it's fine to just use the thing, but it's also good to understand how the thing works and why it works. So we are going to look a little bit deeper at why views work the way that they do. And it has to do with the way variables and structs fit together, and this thing called combiner views, which is just a blanket statement for like HStack, VStack, etc. You've already been using combiner views, but we're just going to talk about why and how those work. And then we're going to talk about state. And state works with a thing called property wrappers. Now, if you haven't done the homework, this will be totally new to you. If you've already started it, you've already been working with this and may have been either fine. I think the Apple documentation does a good job explaining it, or maybe confused or had some questions. So I'm hoping today's lecture will bring clarity to questions that you may have around that. But of course, this is a conversation we'll continue to have through the remainder of the semester. But state, of course, is how the app, doesn't just display things, but it does things. So it's how you as the user can interact and change the app and all that kind of thing. And the views, the UI, they reflect what the state is. And this will be an ongoing conversation. We're just beginning the conversation today. All right, so let's go ahead and open Xcode and begin. And click enter. So when Xcode opens for the first time, you're going to get a window like this. And on the right-hand side, it's going to show a list of recent projects that you've been working on. Left-hand side, it's showing you the version. So we should all be on version 14.2. Just for consistency, this is the latest version. And we can create a new project, clone an existing, or open project. So the clone and existing, this has to do something with Git. Now we're going to look at Git next week, but this week, don't worry about it. But just keep that in mind. And of course, you've already been doing your homework. You probably have a landmarks project maybe here on the right-hand side, and you can click it here, or you can click open to find it. We're going to create a new project just to show some things, and this is just going to be like a throwaway test. So if you click that, it will open, and you immediately get this screen. Now, you can see the default is multi-platform app, and that's what we want to use. You can go into, if you see iOS, there are a lot more specific things just for iOS. We see like augmented reality app, Swift Playgrounds app, and again with macOS, right, we see that there are specific things for these platforms that are a little bit different. Also note, maybe tvOS, the API is not installed, but you can always add it, right? So I don't have it installed currently because I'm not building for tvOS. Now, it used to be that you'd start with iOS and you would add multi-platforms separately, but they've added this, and this really is sort of the easiest way and the best way to go for the future. And it's nice because you get multi-platform sort of out of the box. So that sounds good. So we'll go ahead and click next. We'll just call this test. And you should have a team here, but you may not if you don't have a developer account, and that's okay. The idea here in the organization bundle is whatever your domain is, and it's a reverse domain. So you put the com first, and then you can see the bundle identifier gets created for you, which becomes com made by Douglas.test, which is the name of the app. So that gets added for you. And we won't be using core data or tests, so we'll leave those unchecked. So then it's going to ask, where do you want to put this? And again, hopefully last week you did create a developer folder in your root user. So like in the Mac hierarchy, you have this kind of structure where it's your computer, hard drive, there's a folder of users, then your user, and then this, you'd have to create it yourself. But if you do, you get the little hammer icon, and it sort of fits with all of how Apple expects development to be done. But you can use a different structure if you want. But I would recommend this one because when we get to using Git repositories, like next week, it's nice to have all of these things in one place. You can, for this, you can leave it checked or unchecked, but we'll go ahead and leave that checked. So I'm going to go ahead and create. And you should get a window like this. I'm going to go ahead and make it big. And you can see it is building for the first time up here, and now it says ready, which is why now the preview can begin. So the way the preview works is it is building by itself in the background. But if you want to build it yourself, you can come here and click the play button. Now play will not only build, but it will also run. Right now you can see that test, this is the name of my project, and this is the target of where it's going to build. And so by default, because we selected multi-platform, it will build onto my Mac. But you can see there are a number of iOS simulators that we can build to, which is important. We will want to see how it looks on iOS. You may see this build that says any iOS or any Mac. This is when we submit to the App Store. This is something else, but we won't look at that right now. And you also notice that these just build, but they don't run. So when we put on my Mac, it builds the project, which means that it compiles it. It compiles the Swift code into zeros and ones, and then it runs the code on, my actual Macintosh. These two options, all they do is build the code, turning the Swift code into zeros and ones so that it is ready, for example, to be uploaded to the App Store, something like that, and packaged as an app. But when we're testing and developing, we want to not only build the app, we want to run it, and maybe on Mac or on a simulator. For now, we'll leave it on Mac. So this is the default that Swift UI kind of generates for us, and we get a little preview on the right. I'm going to come back to this as we want to talk about views in more detail, but first I just want to show a few things about Xcode itself. So again, because my cursor is here by the VStack, we can see that this panel on the right hand side has changed. And so it actually is showing you some of the things that it has. So for example, the color is the accent color, which is default. If we change it to red, you can see that the globe here has changed to red. And you can see that my code, it says foreground red. So these things are all in sync, which is quite nice. This used to not be the case with the storyboard. You'd have to sort of manually create connections from your code to the storyboard. But this is all sort of automatic now. However, maybe we don't want it red, so we'll go back to accent color. Now what's interesting though is the way it did this is by saying color, accent color. It certainly works, but that's not the original of what it was, because this blue dot here on the left hand side is telling us there's a change. This is Git that is tracking changes for us. We'll talk more about that next week. But for now, you can know if you see this blue dot, it means, well, there is a change in your file since it's begun. And we can actually click this and show the change. And we can see, oh, interesting. The way it was originally written is just dot accent color instead of, this is the way that the, autocomplete did it when I selected it here. So why do I show you this? Well, these things are smart and they are neat, but they're still kind of dumb. It's still not, the best. So this original way of written is just a better way because, for example, if I type an S here, it's now broken, but the compiler has no way to know that it's broken because that's just a string. And you can see it now, the globe doesn't show, the color is blank, so it's confused, but it doesn't throw an error. Conversely, here we know that this will work, and it won't show an error. So what I want to do is, we're still, right now, see, I can't change this because this isn't, it's kind of grayed out because we're just looking at the change, but we haven't like reverted back to this, so to say. So I can actually say discard change, and now it has reverted back to when I first opened the file to what it was before we did anything. In any case, what I was going to show is, for example, if I add an S here, and it's mistyped, it immediately knows that there's an error, right? It's telling me. So the point of this is, yes, there are multiple ways we can say accent color to this thing, but if we can avoid string literals, we want to do that. So this is a much better way to write that. Sometimes, though, you can't avoid them. For example, up here, this image says system name globe. That is the way to do it because there is no .globe, unfortunately. But there is a name. Now, where does this come from, though? This says system name globe. We get an image of a globe, which is cool. Well, it turns out that system name accesses a bunch of things called SF symbols. And we can actually click here and we can figure this out. So if you have a thing that you're questioning, on your keyboard, if you hold down the Option key, you'll notice that your cursor changes to a little question mark. And so if you click that, it will give you this nice little pop-up menu. And so this is telling you what the thing is doing. It's creating a system symbol image. You can say it's an initializer. So we know that this is the initializer for, in this case, the image struct. And it's taking system name, which is of type string. And this actually tells us, creates an image using system provided symbol, uses SF symbols, it even highlights for us, to find symbols and their corresponding names. So it turns out Apple has a whole bunch of symbols, like several, I think they have 500 or so now, built into the system that you can use for your iconography, which is quite nice. This is another relatively new thing. Now, certainly you can use your own icons. In fact, you can create your own SF symbols. You can create custom ones. What's nice about them is they adapt to different font sizes and as well as things like bold or thin fonts. So let's go ahead and click this SF symbols and see what happens. So if we click that, it's going to open a web page to the browser where Apple is telling you about SF symbols. And this is on the documentation page with design. And it turns out there's actually an application that Apple creates that helps you manage and find all these different images. So I would like you to download this this application. It doesn't come from the App Store, it just comes straight from Apple's website, but go ahead and download it here and it'll give you access to all these things. And this will be really great as you want to develop your own icons or use existing system icons. You can also see this is part of the Apple design page, and they have all kinds of things like product bezels for marketing, things like that, badges and logos, etc. You get the idea. That's all we're going to look about that today, but this will be helpful in the future. But now you know and understand kind of where this comes from, and you can look up how to change it. So for example, once you have SF symbols downloaded, you can open it up and maybe, I don't know, I don't want a world, I want, let's see, this tent sort of looks cool. So what I can do is I can copy the name and I can come here and paste that in. And you see it's exactly what it is. It's tent.circle.fill. And you can see it's already updated here. So that's just a little overview of how SF symbols work, the canvas works, and the different menus as configuration panel on the right-hand side works. So let's look at a few other Xcode things. So on this right-hand side, you'll notice there are these icons up at the top. So this is the one that we're on, this configuration, but you can change it to, it has a couple of different options depending on what you're looking at. So this folder file thing is telling me about this file. It's saying, hey, this file, which is called content view over here, this thing is here. It's telling you where it is on your computer, which can be nice sometimes. So you can find the path of where your actual Swift files are, where the project is, and all of that. You can click this button to open the Finder. This target membership is good. It's telling you that it's part of your project. We named it test, but it would be whatever the name of your app is. Now, the old way to do multi-platform would be to have multiple targets. So you might have test iOS, test macOS. The new way, though, it's all one target. So for example, if you do the extra credit on the homework that has to go into multi-platform, you may notice they do it a little bit differently than how the project is set up. And that's because they're still doing it the old way. Now, if you're not worried about multi-platform, that's fine. That's more extra credit anyway. But for those that are, I just want to point this out, and we can talk more about that as those questions arise. Then this is like text editor things. You can indeed choose between spaces or tabs, and you can choose how many and that sort of thing. But I would highly suggest just leave this as a default unless you've programmed, a lot before and you have a specific reason to have to do it a specific way. Basically, though, most people, just leave this alone. Now, the next page, again, has to do with Git, and this is tracking our changes, but we'll talk more about that next week. Sometimes there's quick help depending on what you're looking at, what the file is. For example, oh look, we clicked here on that system name, and now it's showing us this is the same help that if we came here and we clicked here. So you see this information and this information is the same. So just another way to surface that for you. And this is a thing that just helps to make sure that your project is accessible and that it meets the different accessibility components of Apple. And so it's showing you a few things about the element. And for example, right now our identifier is none. So if we wanted to make this more accessible, we might add an identifier and sort of say so that screen readers, right, would say what it is. But even without doing anything, screen readers will be able to read this label of tent circle fill. But it might be nice to, add some information to that. And then back here, of course, is the sort of configuration panel. Okay, the last thing about this thing on the right is if you want, you can hide all the inspectors. You can just hide them and make them go away. So that's how you sort of toggle that on and off. Another thing, so with this canvas, you see this little icon, we can always hide the canvas if we don't want to see it. And you can see now our editor view, it takes the whole view. But we can also bring that back and we can sort of resize how we want this to be. Now this little arrow thing, this has to do with Git, this code review, so we're not going to look at that today. But this one, this is how you can do split views. So if we click this, we can actually add a whole new editor. So here we have content view, and here we also have content view. Now you notice it moved the canvas below because of the automatic constraints. It put the canvas below, which kind of works in this case. Now maybe I don't want the canvas on this one, but I have it here. And maybe on this one, I don't want to look at content view, but I want to look at test app. So now you can see I have test app on the right, and I have content view here on the left. Now also you see that these each get a tab, so there's content view here, but on the right, it gets its own list of tabs. And so this changes depending on how you add to each editor. So like each split panel sort of has its own hierarchy. So if I go to assets over here, you can see it has content view and assets. But on the right-hand side, it's content view and test app because that's what I opened when my cursor was on that side. Okay, and if we want to get rid of the split view, there's this little X here, and we can click that to get rid of it. Now we're back to this main view, right, with our main list of tabs. And the canvas has sort of taken a lot of space again, so we might shrink that down. And this assets tab, I can go ahead and close that since I don't need that hanging around. There are a few other things behind the canvas that you can sort of explore on your own, but for the most part, you don't need to change these. Comparison has to do with Git, same with the assistant. Now the layout, right, this is how you change. You notice it's on automatic, which is why when we did the split screen, it put the canvas on the bottom. If you want, you can force so the canvas is always only on the right or always only on the bottom. But I find automatic is the best. One thing that's kind of cool is this thing called a mini map. So if we click that, it actually, you can see it here on the right, And we'll go ahead and close the canvas since that's maybe distracting at this point. But you see this mini-map, it has to do with our text. And so you see the mini-map updates in real time. As I highlight on the left, the mini-map highlights in the same. And you can see as I mouse over, it's showing me, oh, that's the body, this is the previews, right? It's connected with this thing, this thing. So anyway, when you have much larger files and such, right? Usually you have files that are much more complicated than this. The mini-map can be quite helpful to kind of get an overview and see what's going on. And for example, if you use mark hello there, that will show up here. You can see it actually says hello there. So you can kind of read these get very prominently shown. That can be quite useful to understand the structure, particularly of a complicated file project. And in Xcode, so remember in Swift Playgrounds, we can do this and it's sort of bold like that, but that's all it is. But in Xcode, okay, we get that heading as well. But the other thing in Xcode, if you add a dash after the thing, then this line appears the whole way. And you also notice the line shows up in the outline. So think of this as like your H1 header. And, you know, this is like your H2 header kind of a thing. Now, one thing, if multiple marks are near each other, the mini-map will only show one of them. You notice it only shows hello there. It doesn't show hi. And that's because hello there is like the primary header. It has this dash. And so this one is so close to it, it only shows the primary one. But if we mouse over hello there, then you can see hi shows up as this little red thing. So if we create another one, you can see it's far enough away, it shows up by itself. And also, if I highlight so I can see the one that's hidden, that sort of thing. So anyway, there's just ways to outline and get some structure in your files. And this will be helpful as you develop more complicated applications. All right, so we looked at the inspector and the configuration panel here on the right. We looked at some of the options. We also looked at the toolbar along the top, right? And we can change both our target, our project, and then the target of where the project is being built. Now we can click run and it will run this thing on my Mac. But if we click the little down arrow, if you click and hold the little arrow, you can see there are some alternative things. These have to do with more advanced debugging, and we're not going to look at those right now, but it is good to know that these sort of exist. Typically, right, run is what we typically do. And so you can see in that time it did build, and the build was successful, and so now it is running, and this is a Mac application on my Mac, and you can see it looks like our preview that we had. So the app is running, it even shows up in my dock and all that kind of thing. But you'll notice there's no app icon, so it looks like this. We can go ahead and stop that. So we've looked at the toolbar, we've looked at the right-hand side, but we still haven't looked at the left-hand side, this navigation sort of explorer. So let's take a look at that. So you can see we can change between our files, and every project has this assets catalog is what it's called. And when you do your homework, you'll use this. They'll ask you to add some images in here, and to set the app icon, you need to set images here, and that's explained in another video. We also have certificates. This is how the app runs on your system and sort of meets Apple's security requirements. You can see this app sandbox and these sorts of things. We typically don't modify that directly. And there's a thing called preview content and preview assets. This is where you might put specific images for the preview. So for example, our preview, which is here on the canvas, the way that the preview works is through this thing down below, right? In Swift Playgrounds, this is hidden from you. You don't see it. But in Xcode, you actually see the code that makes this playground work. So for example, if I comment out this code, the playground is not going to work. You can see it's not happy, this is not happy, all these things. Now, for example, or if I were to remove all of this, you see the canvas, it immediately goes away because without this code, there is no preview. So in case your preview is not working or something like that, be sure to check this code because I think Swift Playgrounds was maybe not as stable, but Xcode is pretty stable, so the preview really should work. Like if the preview is not working, it's probably more likely there's something wrong with your code than with the system or with Xcode at this point. It's pretty stable. So you'll notice, right, I have the canvas checked, but nothing shows up because this does not exist. And so you'll notice that's why in other files, right, that don't have a preview, they don't have a canvas. And when you create, Swift files that are just your data or something like that, they don't have a canvas. And that's to be expected, right? Not every piece of code has to do with the user interface. So it's not always going to have a preview. But we want our preview to work, and so we will undo this. Now, sometimes these previews can be manipulated just like your actual code can be. And for example, you might want to, I don't know, have some image, right? And maybe you would add something like an SF symbol. Okay, or maybe you don't want to use a system, you just want to use an image, my image or something like that. So where does this come from? Well, it comes from this preview content, the preview assets. So just like here, if we want to use an image, maybe not a system image, but an image with our own, my own image, that's going to come from this asset. And the homework will kind of elaborate on this. And so anyway, preview images come from the preview assets. So that's sort of all that is. Oh, and I typed this wrong, which is probably why it's not happy. So yeah. But we don't want to do any of that, so we will just leave the previews as it is. We also don't need this. Yeah. And we'll go ahead. I mean, the tent is fun, but let's just return to globe. It looks like I added a line here, so we'll also remove that just for consistency and simplicity. Okay. What else can we do on this panel on the left? Well, this again has to do with Git repositories. We won't look at that. But this actually shows you all of the objects in your program. It sort of gives you a hierarchical. I think our project's so simple that the flat doesn't make a difference, but it's showing you the different objects, right? Content view is a struct. It is an object. Test app, that is also a struct, an object. So this is showing you all of those things, and you can open up what's inside it to see what each thing has. And it shows you, when I click here, it takes you to that file and that line to show you where it is. And you can see the previews is also its own object, its own struct. So this can be handy looking through all your objects in your project. Search, of course, is just what it sounds like. I can type in body, and now I can see where body is, right, on each of my files. And oh, look, it's also in whatever the heck this is, which, don't worry, we'll come back to this, but this is the settings page. This is like different project settings. It so happens that it has a property called body, and so it showed up in the search. Typically, you don't want to change this stuff, but it's helpful to know that when you search for things, it also finds things in these setting files. Okay, now the next one, this is a little warning icon. So if we build and if we have problem, like for example, let's say that we create a var and we set it to 5. And let's go ahead and build this project. So again, the play button will build and run it. But if you just want to build, you can go to product and build. And the other thing you'll notice is the hotkey for this is Command B. So Command R for run, which is the same as that play button, Command B for build. So build is compiling our code, but not necessarily running it on a target device yet. So we will go ahead and build that. Oh, and okay. Well, I was expecting to throw a warning because I created a variable and I don't do anything with about that. There we go. So once in a function, you see this warning shows up. It's saying, hey, you created this variable, but it was never used. Maybe you should replace it or remove it. And replacing it with underscore, let's see, what does that do? Let's click this fix. Huh, so what the heck is that? Well, it is a variable, it is sent to 5, but it's just an underscore, it has no name. Essentially, this does not actually exist in the system. So what this allows you to do is the code can compile, but this won't take any resources from you, but the code is still there like as a placeholder for you to finish later. It's sort of a reminder. You might also add to do, make this work, because it doesn't do anything. But at least with the underscore, it doesn't use resources, and so it doesn't throw a warning. But if we give it its name back, and we can get rid of that, okay, we have this warning. Well, this little area here, this is a home where all the warnings go. So right now there's just one, it's sort of obvious, but sometimes you may have many, many warnings, and they may only show up when you build the application, not like all the time like this one. Anyway, this list will show you those warnings. It also shows you errors, and it will take you to the line and to that part of the project where you need to go to solve that warning or error. So that's pretty handy. This next one has to do with tests. So there is this whole concept of testing your code, but we're not going to look at that. It's just outside the scope of our class, but tests would show up here. And finally, then there is a bugs section. Oh, so I guess, okay, maybe I misspoke. So I think errors show up here when, for example, if we build and you get an error, it would show up here, as where warnings just show up here. All right, now what is this? This thing is a breakpoint. So what the heck is a breakpoint? Well, it so happens that as we type and write along our code, you notice that it gives us lines, right? We have line 1, 2, all the way to 32. So each line gets numbered, which is handy if you're working with a friend and you say, hey, I have an issue, and it's on line 22, for example, this warning that we have. But the other thing you can do, if you come to this 22, you can actually click on it, and this little blue thing will appear. And it so happens you can click on any line you want, up here, 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 here. You can click on all the lines you want. And you can even, if you click and drag, you can move a thing around. Okay, so what are these blue things? Well, they're breakpoints. You can see that as I've clicked these things, these breakpoints show up on this list on the left. And so each one, as I click, it's taking me to that line, right? So that's quite handy. So, okay, but what is a breakpoint? Well, when you run your code, it causes the code to stop at that line. So let me show you what I mean. I sort of created a lot Let's just have one that's more practical. So to delete them, if you click, you just pull away and you notice a little X appears. So once the X appears, once I let go, it just goes away. Poof, it's gone. You can also come here, you can right click, and you can delete a breakpoint. Okay, so let's remove all these. This function doesn't actually do anything, so let's remove that. But let's leave, so this breakpoint is right here in the image, and let's go ahead and run and see what happens. Okay, so the build completed, we know it worked. We have the app icon here, test is here, but there's no window. I can't actually see test anywhere. And it feels like it's frozen. And that's because it is. And you see this green line, it says thread 1, breakpoint 1, 1. Well, so that's exactly it. The code is frozen where you placed the breakpoint. So this is a real helpful way to debug and figure out what your project is doing, right? In case there might be a time when you have a bug and it's confusing what's going on. Well, if you create a breakpoint, then this is a way to kind of slow down and see what's happening in the project. So this can be quite useful. So you notice that this is a breakpoint that we created. So it has this green line, and that's because there's no bug here. There's nothing wrong with the program. It's just stopped because we told it to stop. So it is frozen, but that's okay because we told it to freeze. And that's why the interface has not finished loading, because we stopped it before it could finish loading. You'll also notice here on the bottom, this menu has appeared. And if you remember earlier, this is the debug area. And so this sort of shows up automatically when it needs to. Now, if you want to manually toggle it, there is this little button here. And so clicking that makes it hide, which is actually where it's been this whole time. But clicking it has it show up. Now, the debug area has two spots. This black area is where if you had a print statement, prints would show up here. You can also type commands here for specific reasons. On the left, though, this would show you the hierarchy. Now, in this case, we don't really have anything, so it's empty. But here, it's kind of giving us an idea of, it's this thread, closure. This is just where the program is. But this could give you, it's called a stack trace. If there is a bug or something, it might show you more on the hierarchy of the objects or whatnot. Anyway, it's blank right now. But what I want to call your attention to is this. So right now breakpoints are on, and that's what's frozen. But we can continue the program execution, right? So once we stop, we may want to see what the next thing is, or there's some different stepping instructions. So you can step into and out of it. There's sort of some nuance here. And there's some other debugging tools. We're not going to look at all of that, but it's just good to know, okay, debugging stuff, that's here. And it's going to show up on this menu. So what I do want to show is if we go ahead and click continue, okay, it kept going. Essentially that green thing went away. It doesn't feel frozen anymore. And of course, the application actually showed up, and it is indeed running. You notice this is here. We can actually pause. So even without a breakpoint, we can pause it. And so now we can see like what the system is doing or where it is in that moment. What's happening underneath the hood, as one might say. The other thing that we can see is here on the left, it is showing us like how much CPU, memory, energy impact. So this is another part of debugging, right? It's one thing to get rid of bugs, but the other thing is you want your program to run well, right? You hear developers talk about high performance applications. Well, for our class, everything we're doing is so simple, it doesn't, performance will not be an issue. But when you do more complicated things, this is how you would check, and you would see, well, how much memory is my app using, and is that, acceptable? How much CPU is it using? Do certain commands cause performance issues? Will this affect battery life, right? This is especially important for mobile applications, right? An iPhone is, you create an app that drains users' batteries, right? Users are gonna hate your app. So this is something important if you do more complicated things to look at. That is sort of debugging, breakpoints, these kinds of things. The other thing with breakpoints, you can add them and delete them. You can also just disable them. So this one, it's still there, right, as a reminder, but it's not on. So for example, if we stop and we run it again, it just runs normal because that's not on. But if you turn it on, well, nothing's happened yet because it so happens that this is only run once, right? It's run once when the app started, but it is not being called again. Now, if we had code that would change this user interface, right, then this would be run again, and that sort of thing. And then this breakpoint would trigger. So you can enable and disable as well as removing. And if you right click, you can see all these different commands like enabling or deleting and then other options. So the last little thing on the left here is this report navigator. This is basically like a log. It's a system log. It's a history of all the things you've done. So I can see, oh, I ran it. Yep. I built, you launched, and then, built. Oh, and you can see there's some errors, right? Because if you remember when I was messing around, yeah, the preview crashed. It didn't build because something was wrong. So that's all kept here. So I can actually kind of go back in time. And so you can see all these builds, build for preview, these are all automatic builds for the preview that's happening, automatically in the background. And that is to keep that preview live and responsive. Whenever it detects a change, essentially it rebuilds, right? If there's no change, it's fine, it doesn't need to rebuild. So this, could be useful looking through the log. Okay, so typically you'll have this on the file structure and all of that, and we'll be here. And this is sort of the general layout when we're working. We have our code, we have our canvas, and we have our menus. But if you want, just like on the right-hand side, on the left-hand side, you can hide, right? So you can hide that as well. I wanted to look at another thing. So if we go up and we click this test, which is the name of our project, it loads this, page, which what the heck is this? And it kind of showed up because our search, right? Our search query found something named body in here. It essentially is a bunch of settings about your application. And typically it'll start you on the info panel. It was build settings because that's what the search query, it had found something in here. But if we're looking here, this is info and we're about our project, and it's telling us some general information. So for example, the deployment target for the different platforms, and some things about how we debug or release. For intents of this class, and you won't really be messing with this, and I've sort of tried to intentionally keep that simple, right? That you only need to do this for sort of specific reasons. But it's maybe good to be aware that this exists. So if we go back to the build settings, these are how it builds the program, how it compiles Swift code into machine code. And there are different settings that you can change if you want. And you can see things like, oh, Objective-C. So this is maybe how it interops with Objective-C. Like you see this Apple Clang. Well, the Clang is the compiler that, is made by Apple and stuff like that. It's part of the steps of compiling the code. Here's the Swift compiler. And anyway, that sort of thing. Okay, so back to info. But another thing that we should look at is we've been looking at the project. And that really is what it sounds like. This is the project that we're working on, how the project gets built. But what the whole point of the project is that it builds apps, it builds applications. So those applications, those are actually called targets. So that's why you see there's project, but then there's target. They both share the same name because our project is named test and our app is called test, but they are kind of, slightly two different things. That's why the app icon here, this is like an Xcode, this is our project for building, but this is just the app store icon. It is the final result. So these are settings for your final result, for the target and the end result of the app or product that you're making. And so it used to be that you would need to create multiple targets for each operating system. But now they've made it much easier. And so you just have one target, but you can have different, they call them destinations. And you can see, because we selected multi-platform, things we already have iPhone, iOS, iPad, and then we have Mac, macOS. And so we can see that this is all using Swift UI, but the iOS will also use UIKit, the macOS will use AppKit, if you remember from that lecture. Now, you can actually go and add Mac. And so what's interesting is there's two different ways to add Mac, right? We use AppKit and Swift UI, which is what the default is, what we've done. But you can use that Mac catalyst, which if you remember, it is using UIKit to bring your iPad app to the Mac. But if you remember, this is more of a stopgap thing. So for existing projects, you might use this because you already have UIKit code. But for our purposes, we don't need that, and we already have Mac with macOS. And of course, this is sort of the worst option designed for iPad. This is, your unmodified iOS app running on a Mac. So that's just straight up, you have an iPad app in UIKit, just make it work for Mac. But there's no alteration for it. So it's probably not going to look very good, and your users probably won't like it. So this is, the easiest option if you have an iPad, but the worst. Catalyst kind of in the middle, and then the top is the best. And since we are building a new app from scratch, we don't have any legacy code, right? This is the approach that we want. So this does cover, the main destinations, but you notice it doesn't have Apple TV, and I would need to install that. And it also doesn't have the watch, and I would also need to install those libraries, but that's how you would add these different platforms. So then you can have one app that runs on every Apple device. Now, you'll notice the minimum deployments. Here, we actually have version numbers. So you want to keep these, for our intents and purposes, up to date. So 6.2 is sort of the latest in this version of Xcode, and 13.1. And that's what we want to access the latest features. And so you just set it here. And what happens is if we go to the project, see how it says default? Well, it gets these values, actually gets these values from here. So if you want, you can explicitly set them, but that multiple places, but then you might have a mismatch. So it's best just set them, one place, at least for our case, which is simple, right? We don't have a complicated setup. Now, if you remember, we created a name, we called it test, and so that name is here, and you cannot change this name. You'd have to, I think, change it on the Apple developer website, or well, you'd have to create a new Xcode project, basically. But the display name, you can always change that, and version of builds. This is sort of as you update your app and deploy to the App Store and that kind of a thing. Finally, some basic stuff for iPhone and iPad. You can choose, right, which orientation. And so the default is, you notice the iPhone, you typically don't support the upside down orientation on iPhone, right? Typically the default is not checked. But on iPad, you do support all of them. And this is just sort of, convention and how people use those devices and the physical size of them. So it pretty much covers that. There is also this thing about signing and capabilities. So this has to do with your developer account, publishing the App Store, that sort of thing. And you want to use the automatically managed signing. This is by default. It makes it much easier. But when we get to publishing the App Store, we'll look at this in more depth. You also have to consider which features you might use and which permissions you need to get from the system. Like you have to ask permission for the camera. On the Mac, you have to say if you're using network connections, that sort of thing. And there's some other options here. Okay, this info, this is what is called the P list. Sometimes you need to make changes here, but usually you don't. And again, there are also, just like there were build settings for the project, there are build settings for the target. And these are similar, but a little different. And there's also something called build phases. This is how different sources get connected together. So for example, the assets, right? These are images that we see on the left, here. Well, this is how those assets get added to the application. It happens at this build phase, this copy bundle resources. And indeed, the build rules is sort of the rules that manage all of this stuff. This is how this happens to begin with. That's it for the app settings. There are some other things we can look up at Xcode, right? We have a lot of menus up here. And on the first Xcode, we can always click About. This is just that little, gives us the version number, that sort of thing. We can also come down and click Settings. And this is your main settings for Xcode. And this is kind of how you can change your personal preferences, right? And there are a couple of things. For the most part, you just leave this as it is, but you can sort of make some changes, maybe to like the system. Maybe you want it always in dark mode, always in light mode, or something like that. This is where you would add your developer account, or so you add, and at least add your Apple ID. So you would sign in to Apple ID, and if you have a developer account, that will show up. The other thing I want to show is this themes. So you can change. I tend to, for example, I let the interface stay with the system. It either is light or dark, but the theme, I always prefer dark. So it's easier, on my eyes, and so I always have the text to be this default dark theme. And so you can change this, right? They have a lot of different themes, and this is something that is, change it to what you like or whatnot. So I find just the default dark quite good. You can change the font, size, that sort of thing. You can, go nuts. And one thing that just looking at this is then what's nice with the theme is it also shows you, well, what color each color means. So sometimes you can kind of infer, well, I know these pink things are like, the types, right? But then I'm not sure why the window group is pink, and that seems to, but then my var is blue, and why is my struct this really bright pink? Well, when you look at the theme, you can come and see exactly what it is. So, the bright pink is keywords, right? Those are Swift specific keywords. Then we can see the content view, right, which is this teal. Those are project class names. So that makes sense. But the window group, we can see, it's other class names. So that's why that's there, because it's not a class that my project made, that I made. It's from something else. In this case, it's from Apple, but we just know that it's from somewhere else. And so that's why the window group is there, and that's why the types seen in app here and here are also the same color. So you have the type of the class name, or you could see it's not just class, right? It's other type names, or you have the instance of it. And so what that tells us is window group. What is window group? Well, again, we can option click this thing. Window group is a struct. And so it is a special kind of struct that takes this bracket. So actually, but usually we write structs like this. And that's true. That's what you'd be used to. That's how I taught you, is that a struct should have, something like that. Like we would say, let my struct equal window group, right? And that is indeed how you typically write Swift code. But Swift UI uses a lot of shorthand, a lot of clever things. And since this struct takes a closing closure, then we kind of get away from shorthand. So the window group, we never reference this directly, this let my, right? So there's no reason to give it a name. In fact, it's given us an error because we've changed it so it doesn't know what to do with it. It expects to return this by default. But now it's actually confused at what's going on, even though this is valid Swift code, but it's not conventional Swift UI code. And so it is a little bit confusing to the compiler. So we would remove that because it's not needed. And in fact, these open and closing parentheses, because we're not passing anything in, we can remove those as well. And that's why it looks like that. But let's take a look a little closer at what is going on here. And to do that, we want to look at content view. And let's take a closer look at all these things.